And let's see, how are we doing over here? They're doing the Ketchup King and chess gains.
Board one.
And oh my goodness, yeah, this looks like
What
a
is happening?
you know what we call this a little bit? Forget the ketchup. This is called a pickle. This is not good.
So yesterday, Saturday, August 29th, I had the pleasure in playing in the ChessHelps Fundraiser for US Chess online rapid tournament in the under 2000 section. And ChessHelps is actually like a nonprofit charity initiative to benefit the US Chess Federation, as there's not a lot of over the board events going on right now. And the organization is based somewhere out of Arizona, so the clip that you just saw was from the Southern Arizona Chess Twitch channel. And I was the favorite in my section under 2000, as I'm rated right around 1900. And the first two rounds I won, not exactly comfortably, but I did get the wins. And this was the third round game where I was facing an Arizona native with the username the_ketchup_king, who has the white pieces, and myself, chess_gains, with the black pieces. And although, as you can tell by the clip, his rapid rating is somewhere in the 1600 range, his USCF rating is actually just under 1900, and his peak rating is actually higher than my peak rating. So a very even match, and let's see how things get on. So he opens with e4, and I go for my standard d6. We have d4, knight f6, knight c3, and I go for knight d7, the lion defense. And here he goes for g4, the bayonet attack, which I actually featured in a game on my Road to Rapid series. I'll link that in the description below. I had an opponent who played a very similar system against me. Basically, it's a very aggressive idea. You're just going to advance this pawn and try to attack this knight before you even really develop. And in that game, I had played e5. And although I managed to win the game, I realized that that's really not the best way to go, because if you do play e5, white can just play g5, and where's your knight going? It has to go back. So in this game, I simply played h6, which basically all it does is it stops white from playing g5, because now I can take, and if the bishop takes, fine, but I have an open rook now, and this is a perfectly fine position for black. White actually ruined their pawn structure on the king side, so this is good. So here, instead of playing g5, he played bishop e3. And I should also note that something like h4 doesn't really work, because I can just continue with e5. And if he does play g5, I can take, and white cannot recapture with this pawn because of the pin along the h-file. They would have to take with the bishop, and again, this is perfectly fine. It's not really going to cause me too many problems. So in the game, we have bishop e3, and I go for e5, just attacking the center. And he goes h3, just kind of securing these pawns. And now I go for c6, just kind of expanding a little bit. Now I can get my queen in at some point. I can start to create an attack on the queen side. And here he played queen d2. And now I played queen c7, just developing. He goes bishop g2, adding protection to his e4 pawn. And now I decided to make an interesting move. Something normal would have been like bishop e7, just preparing maybe to castle, although I do have to watch out for castling on the side of the board, because he does have a lot of advanced pawns, and actually that's exactly why I play the move g5 here. And the whole point is that I saw the potential of him playing f4. So like, for example, bishop e7, he can play f4, and now he has all these pawns in the center. It's a little bit unnerving when your opponent has pawns and you know that he can push them forward and attack your pieces. So I just played g5 here, and now he really can't play f4, because obviously I have two defenders in the square. He can't push h4, because then this pawn hangs. And although the engine doesn't really like my move, because perhaps it thinks like it's a long-term weakness, I thought that this would be a good way to kind of combat white's play on the king side. So here he played knight to e2, just developing, and I went bishop e7, and now he long castled. So now that he's done this, I know where the attack is going to be. So I immediately play b5, looking to create an attack on the side, play b4, kind of get his knight off center. And here he played knight g3, which creates some space for his knight to retreat, and also looks to throw this knight into the juicy f5 square. Of course, another disadvantage of putting the pawn on g5 is that now no piece can or no pawn I should say, can control the f5 square, and the knight would be very nicely planted here. So here I played knight b6. Now if he plays knight f5, at least I can eliminate the knight with my bishop. And the other thing this move does is it threatens to put the knight on c4 and then fork his queen and bishop. So here he could have played something like b3 to defend that, but that does kind of weaken the king, and then I can just start to advance my pawns and start to try to break up his queenside structure. So instead he decided to first take on e5, and I took, which does open up the queen in the rook's view of the d-file, but he really doesn't have any squares to infiltrate on. I control all of these squares, so he really doesn't have a way to break through. And now he played bishop f1, which looks to prevent the knight jumping to c4 because the bishop will just take. And now, obviously, I don't want to go here because if the bishop takes, I just have doubled pawns, and although I do have the b-file, it's not so great. So instead I played b4, just attacking his knight, which can't go to d5, obviously, because of the pawn, which controls these two squares, can't come to a4 because of my knight. So its only two options are back to e2 and back to b1. And what he probably should have done was just go back to b1, because even though the knight's kind of out of the game, it at least helps defend the king. But here he made somewhat of a mistake. And I should also add that this is a rapid tournament, and the time control is 15 minutes, but only 2 seconds increment. So not the 10 seconds increment that I'm used to playing. This is a lot tougher to play under time pressure. And in this position, my opponent made the first significant error of the game. Instead of moving the knight, he actually took on b6 with the bishop. And he was maybe hoping for something like this, after which he takes my queen, I take his, but then he comes out up a pawn and has a very nice position. But of course, I can take the bishop first. And maybe he also thought that I would take with the queen, and then he would just move his knight back. But instead, I took with the pawn. And now there's a big problem for white, because his knight's under attack, but the knight also is defending the a2 pawn, which after it moves will be hanging. So of course he has to move his knight, and he moves it back to b1. And now, of course, I could have taken on a2 immediately, but I decided not to rush with that, because I saw that after I take, he then gets his bishop in the game and attacks me. And even though I can plant my rook on a1 and create a pin here, I decided not to even allow him to get his bishop in the game. And so I played bishop e6. Now, I can take with the pawn next move, or I can take with the rook. And he, of course, needs to do something here. He is basically going in reverse because his knight's on b1, his bishop moved back to f1, and I'm already creating a dangerous attack on the queen side. So here he played knight f5, which plants the knight on a good square, attacks the bishop, and it also hangs the pawn. And I thought for a little bit and decided that it was not worth taking, because after I take, he then has this check, and then king has to move to f8. He's able to pick up my bishop. And after pawn recaptures, I'm still a little bit better here because I did pick up a nice pawn in the center, but we can see these pawns are doubled and my king is quite exposed. So practically speaking, you want to avoid stuff like this. So instead, I just took the knight as soon as it landed on f5. And after he takes, and again here I have an opportunity to take on a2, but I didn't rush into that, again, because he can then play bishop c4. So first I played b5, just stopping his bishop from coming into the game. I can pick up this pawn at any time. It's not going anywhere. If he tries something like a3, I just take, and I have 2 pieces protecting this pawn. Very bad for white. So he needs to do something here. He needs to create some kind of counterplay, otherwise he's just going to get steamrolled. And he decided to try h4, which has a little bit of a tricky idea, because the threat is to take on g5 here and play against this pin. Obviously my rooks aren't connected, so there could be some kind of problems for me. And actually this most straightforward move here would have just been to take, because if he actually recaptures, he's now putting his rook into the line of fire after knight to e4, an attack against the queen, and a discovered attack against his rook. He is just losing material. But instead I decided to take on g4, which is also fine. Now I'm threatening to take the pawn directly, and here he took on g5 and set a little bit of a trap for me. It looks like I can just take the bishop and create a pin here, but this is exactly what he wanted. If I were to have taken immediately, then he actually sacrifices his queen. And after pawn takes, he takes with check, and not only did he win one rook, but he's actually going to pick up the other. And after the dust is settled, he now has 2 rooks, a knight and a bishop, and all I'm left with is the queen and a knight, I am simply outmatched in terms of material. So to avoid this trap, I now played a move looking to knock his queen off balance, rook to d8. Now his queen can't stay eyeing up this pawn because it simply doesn't have any squares along this diagonal in which it doesn't get taken. Here it gets taken by the knight, here it gets taken by the pawn. And obviously it doesn't want to take here because bishop defends the rook. So the queen has to move, and it only has two squares, e2 and e1, and he chose the one that's slightly inferior by playing queen to e1. What he wanted to do was allow his bishop some flexibility on this diagonal, but the better move actually would have been queen to e2 because it at least attacks the knight, and the bishop can still go this way. But he played queen to e1. But this simply allows me to take on g5 with check, and now he is in a lot of trouble because how does he block this check? He only has one way, and that's to put something on d2. Of course, if he puts a rook there, it can just get taken, so he puts a knight there. And now we've reached the most interesting position of the game, the one that you actually saw in the intro clip. The commentators who were kind of hosting the event were kind of going back and forth between games. Obviously, the U2000 section wasn't the only one. There was also an open section with some grandmasters and international masters, so they were mostly focusing on that. But when they did decide to check in on our section and clicked on myself, who was playing on the top board, they saw this position, and that's where the commentator had a pretty funny line. Because my opponent is in fact here in quite a pickle. This pin is very powerful, and to add to that, the rook is also piling on some pressure. Now the worst thing that I could do in this position is actually take immediately, because after rook takes, and say we trade, now white can breathe a sigh of relief. He's no longer under a lot of pressure. And pressure is something that you have to maintain against your opponent in a lot of situations if you want to win. And here, I can basically just sit back and do almost nothing, and I'm going to have a better position because I have this very powerful pin, his knight can't move, and I have a lot of ways to continue my attack. But I was looking for the most precise way to attack. Obviously, I have this pin, so I could try to just pile on the pressure by doing something like this and put more pressure here. But then this allows him the opportunity to maybe block the pin with something like bishop to d3, and then maybe he'll get his king to safety. So I was thinking, how do I really capitalize here? And after 2 minutes of thought, I actually did end up playing the most precise move here, but before I show you what it is, try to see if you can find it yourself. Black to move, and find the most decisive way to win. So the move for black here is queen to a7. This move comes with two major threats. The first is that it's hitting f2 and threatening to take with the knight and create a fork. But the more important threat is to simply take this pawn and basically threaten to checkmate white's king. And my opponent, I don't exactly remember how much time he spent on this move, but he failed to address either threats, and he simply played bishop to h3, looking to maybe get rid of this knight and send it back, after which he would be able to take on e5, and probably that's what he was hoping for. After something like knight takes f2 and queen takes e5, he has a fork here, and he's able to pick up the rook. But what he failed to realize is the gravity of the danger he was in, and after queen takes a2, it becomes apparent that white's moves are numbered. Because of this pin, he can't block the impending queen to a1 check, and after he, for example, takes the knight, this is simply checkmate. And the only thing he could do to try to prolong the game is maybe block the bishop, and okay, I'll just take, and then he can try to maybe create some room for his king to escape. But then I just take with en passant, and after pawn takes, I can then bring my rook to d3, and this is just savagery. I'm just winning by brute force. There's nothing he can do to fight back. My next move is going to be rook takes pawn with checkmate, and the only thing he can do is maybe sacrifice his queen to prolong the game a little bit more, but realistically speaking, the game is just over. And after the move queen takes a2, he sat there for a few minutes and tried to figure out a way to wiggle out, but he quickly realized that he's lost and resigned in this position after just 22 moves. So yeah, very crazy tactical battle, and I was able to get a nice win in round 3 that also made it onto Southern Arizona Chess's Twitch channel. But unfortunately, the tournament ended in tragedy for me, as in the final round, round 4, I was playing basically for first place against the only other person who was 3 for 3 going into the round. And after about 40 moves, we reached this position where I'm going to show you the timestamps because we both had very little time. about 20 seconds apiece, and we traded rooks, and he tried to advance his pawn, but I quickly caught it and then won it. But this is still quite tricky because even though I'm up a pawn, I have a lot of weaknesses on my dark squares, or light squares actually. And in this position, what I should have simply done was advance my king and try to just hold this for a draw, or maybe even try to play something like d5 and trade the pawns and go into the final stage up a pawn in which I simply can't lose unless I blunder. And just watch what happens. So in this position I played rook to e5, attacking his bishop, but now his bishop comes to f6. And with 19 seconds on the clock, of course, it's nerve-wracking, hard to find a good move. But I play a lot of blitz and bullet, so it shouldn't be a problem. And now I played rook to e6, thinking that I was creating a pin against his bishop and putting him under a lot of pressure. But I missed a very critical tactic, even in the endgame, and he simply took on d4 with check, hitting my king and creating a discovered attack against my rook. And after bishop takes, rook takes, it's simply game over. My bishop is no match for his rook, and even though this game continued for about 20 more moves, it was basically me just hoping that he would stalemate me. But at a certain point, I simply resigned and unfortunately finished second in the tournament, which just goes to show that mistakes can be made under time pressure, even by pretty strong players. And you should always be aware of your surroundings, even in endgames, because tactics always happen. But on the plus side, I had a very nice game in round 3 and made it onto the Twitch channel with a pretty funny highlight. So hope you enjoyed that, and stay tuned for more interesting stuff on the channel.